Hi, I'm Carol Carter, and this is For Art's Sake. My name is Carol Carter. I'm an artist from St. Louis, Missouri, and I work primarily in watercolor, although I did paint in acrylic for 30 years. And I am excited to be showing at Parkland College this body of work, which is a retrospective of my watercolor output of about 25 years. So we're going to start with the oldest paintings in the group, which are called Night and Day Crotons. And in the early 2000s, I decided to paint monumental watercolors of very indigenous botanicals of Florida. So that included crotons, banana leaves, hibiscus, different vegetation that was always seen in Florida, which is where I grew up. So this is my version of crotons. This one is the darker palette, the night one, and this is the day one, and they're softly linked together by this Prussian blue wash that unify the painting. I grew up in Florida, so I've never not been interested in it. And I long for it in my heart, so I always tend to paint very tropical imagery, a lot of light palette, more colorful palette to indicate that warmer feel in life. So I tell my students, paint what you love. So I end up painting what I love, which is my nostalgia for Florida. Yeah, I think when I was learning watercolor as a student, we all painted in smaller scale paintings that would fit on your lap or, in a portfolio. And that was sort of the boundaries of my knowledge of the medium, of the potentiality of the medium. And then I went to graduate school. I went to Washington University, and I didn't work in watercolor for 2 years. They discouraged it. So I switched to acrylic, and I taught myself acrylic, and I painted 10-foot acrylic paintings, 8 by 10 feet, actually for a long time, but certainly for my thesis show. And so after painting large-scale acrylics for 2 years, I turned my attention back to watercolor, and I just thought, I want to paint environmental size watercolor, super size watercolor, and I just exploded on the scene by doing large-scale watercolors, and I got known for that. Because when you paint this size, you have to notice it, whether it's in any medium, but certainly watercolor, which is delicate and transparent and soft, so it tends to grab more attention when it's this big. But I don't always work this big. And I've learned since then, because I went to graduate school about 35 years ago, since then I've learned that you can make just as beautiful a painting small scale as large scale. So it's not like everything I do has to be this size. But that's part of the motivation. So when I grew up in Florida, the one place that I felt was the most happy place on earth was around a pool. And I'm not a competitive swimmer. I didn't swim on a swim team or be real athletic about it, but I did enjoy the water. And so I learned early on in my career to paint the pool as just a different environment for the figure to exist in. Because the pool is actually not just about happy times. It can be very threatening if, in fact, you don't know how to swim. And so there's this component, this edgy component about life circumstances to painting the figure in the water environment. I like that conflict in my work. So these are 4 swimmers. This one is the earliest one. I think this is 1997, so this is early. This is a newer one, and these two are a couple of years old. So this painting actually was sold to Barnes Jewish Hospital and in their collection for 20 years. And one day, about 5 years ago, I got a call from a photographer who said, Carol, I have a couple of your watercolors and a couple of my photographs. Do you want your watercolors from Barnes Jewish? And I said, yeah, of course I do. He goes, well, drive out and pick them up. And I said, what happened? And he goes, we got kicked out of their collection because our work was too sexy. And so this was one of the vetoed paintings from the collection, which is too bad because I think it's a beautiful, very non-threatening, non-political painting. And so it's in my personal collection. And so when paintings like that come back to me, and now that I'm such a more seasoned artist, I do have a lot of paintings returned to me over time. I don't sell them. I feel like they've come back to me for a reason. So I'm really glad to have a painting from that long ago. And this is a newer painting, and it's just about dealing a little bit with life after some life circumstances, finding your footing, finding your bearings. And then these two paintings deal with the pandemic. So in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, I decided to build my show for the year around my response to what I was going through as an artist, but as it being as reflective to what everybody was going through in their lives, because we all had pretty much the same issues to deal with. It wasn't just me, but I could only stem from my experience. And so I think this is the most reflective of the time, and this is my response to all the bad news we heard that year, which was not just about the pandemic, but I think when I finally heard the news about George Floyd, I had had enough of being upset by the news. So I wanted to paint a painting that dealt with getting always that bad news that we got as a world society. And so it's called The Blistering Effects of Hearing the News, because it does make you react in a not so calm way. And as a result, I always feel that if I can translate my feelings visually to a painting, then I can leave my feelings there and move on. And that's what I did. So to reinforce the notion of the blistering effect of listening to the news, blistering is obviously dealing with the intensity of heat. I wanted to focus the core of her body as radiating this heat, or reflecting this source of disdain for the news. And so as an artist, one of the ways to create that effect is to imagine the light source as being in the paper itself and emanating out. So the way that I create this piece is I create the inner glow behind the figure, so the figure is suspended in a field of white, and then the rest of the value of the paper is glowing behind her. And then also there's an imaginary glow behind her hands, her arms and her hands, and the hands are silhouetted in front of that to also extend that temperature of emotion. And of course, it's the hotter palette, and there's steam in the water, so the whole thing does make you feel 100 degrees of rage. This painting is also one of the paintings I did for my show about the pandemic, and the show was called Lockdown Solitude, because as a world, we were all locked down, and as people, we all spend a lot of time in solitude. we all had our little bubble networks, but a lot of time was spent alone. So this was one of my paintings that I felt reflected the solitude I was experiencing in my life. And I didn't do a lot of sleeping. Like, I didn't sleep my life away that year, but I did sleep a lot to try to escape a bit of what was happening in my life. And so I wanted to paint that repose of checking out of the drama of the day. And so I painted this figure of the sleeping woman, but it didn't seem to be enough in terms of saying what I wanted to say. So then I added the cutout of the swallows underneath her, and then eventually lifting up, so that you could sort of imagine that what she's dreaming is the bird flying away from the present day dilemmas. So once I added the birds and that narrative, the painting had much more focus and intensity for me. But curiously, this was one of my favorite paintings that my students talked about, and I was surprised you picked it because it's not one of my favorites. I think that show was not one of my favorites because it wasn't a happy show. This is a muted palette, you know, compared to the other ones, and the whole show was muted. And I did another reclining woman laying down, and underneath her, I put another bird or something, and she was also part of the pandemic show. You didn't see it, so you didn't choose her. But she was sleeping, but everybody interpreted her as being dead because of the death toll of the pandemic. But I never would have painted a dead person, you know. But that's why I unframed her and put her away. It's like, oof, that's way creepy. Anyway. Interesting. But technically, in terms of watercolor, this is very sophisticated. This is hard to do. And I think the women that studied with me in the last few days, they gravitated toward this one because they could see how I pulled this off without the struggle that you get when you're first learning my technique. And I get too, but sometimes I get it right. Anyway, yeah, beautiful. Beautiful washes. So in 2018, I decided to do 52 horses in 52 weeks, or 52 horse paintings in 52 weeks, one horse painting a week. And I had been teaching too much, and I felt like I was becoming more of an art instructor and less of an artist. So I wanted to raise the bar on my art expertise by producing this dynamic challenge. So at the beginning of the year, I started the project, and then I would have the exhibition in December. So these 3 horses are from that challenge, and of course, over the course of the year, I learned to paint the horse a lot better and a lot simpler and a lot more with poetry, which I think these 2 horses are a good reflection of. So the horse is done in 2 colors, olive green and shadow green. And 2 colors create all the nuance and value in each of the horses. And they're just very simplified washes with watermarks. And even though it's oversimplified and direct, it took me about a year to figure out what to edit and what to leave out and what to present as the anatomy of the horse. And that's why these 2 horses to me are real representative of my growth in doing a horse. The first horses were very stiff and academic, and then eventually they got much more simplified and poetic. And the reason this horse is vastly different than those horses is that, how can I explain it? These horses look like they're in an environment. They're a subject and then some sort of field of existence. And while I was creating the horse show, I had an emotional crisis, an emotional experience in my personal life. And I ended up taking that anxiety and working it through visually as a painter. So the horse at that point changed from being a horse in an environment or a subject and field to a more silhouetted horse, and the environment became into the horse symbol itself. So that you can imagine sky, field, mountains, distance in this magical horse. And another part of the imagery for this horse is that several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was teaching in France, and my watercolor host took my group of artists and me to the cave La Peche Morel, which has the horse paintings, the cave paintings of horses, bears, animals, deer, handprints in the cave. And so they're very silhouetted images in the cave, and they're prehistoric. They're very touching. And when you go in the cave and you see these images, you go in the dark because they keep the lights off, and then they flip the lights on and you're standing right in front of the painting, which has lasted thousands of years. And it was iconic to me. So this is reminiscent, this format is reminiscent of that experience. That cave, that elemental cave painting of a horse. It's really profound. Yeah. I was standing next to one of my students from India who had flown to France, and we happened to just be standing together in the darkness. You didn't know who you were next to. And when the lights flipped on and we saw the art in front of us, we both burst into tears, because you're like, how did they do this? How did they get 500 feet into the cave in the dark with torches and take the time to paint? Pretty special. Yeah, and also in the cave, they didn't get it right. So they would put lines to get it right, and then they got it right, and I don't know. And then I tried to make the paper look like the cave. I antiqued the paper. So if you saw the horse show, all 52 paintings, but I ended up doing 87 paintings, you could see the development, the emotional crisis, and then the way that I worked through it visually. You could see the work change. Now, I didn't go around saying that to people, but the people that were studying with me, they knew it, so you could see this great, and then this great, and I wouldn't have gotten to that unless something had happened in my personal life. And that's why I tell students, I said, or anybody, you don't paint when life is perfect. You paint your way through everything, because that's the only way you deepen your message. We're not going to get out of things that go wrong in life. But too many artists are like, I can't paint, my granddaughter's sick, It can't be like that. You've got to force on. So these two paintings are from my series that I painted about the elements. Earth, fire, water, air. I thought, how is that going to be painted in watercolor? That's a hard topic. And actually I did a little research, and there's 5 elements, but they edited out one. It's earth, fire, water, air, metal. So I painted 5. And I sold most of them, obviously. There are only 2 left here. And believe it or not, the hardest element for me to paint was air, because how do you paint air? So I ended up using the Tibetan prayer flags to denote the breeze of the air and the atmosphere. And the easiest one to paint was fire, which is curious because fire is such an elusive subject to paint. But as you can see, it's very much radiating heat and capturing that glow of the light within the fire itself coming out. So that was a series of 5 large-scale watercolors, and they were also exhibited in a couple of gallery shows, and then also at the airport for 6 months, which was neat. And now they're here, which is nice. So these Buddhas are all different views of the same Buddha. I painted it in different ways, painted the Buddha in different ways. And this is part of the Lockdown Solitude show. So one of the things I thought about during the year of the pandemic was everybody, including myself, returned to a sense of spiritual searching and something more to think about than how to get out of this mess, like some deeper meaning to life. So I wanted to present a way to talk about the spiritual component to that year where we were all in a quandary. So I settled on the Buddha as a non-threatening spiritual motif. And it's painted in a muted palette. Once again, there's only 2 colors, olive green and shadow green. Well, I like how there's a pleasantness to the expression. The Buddha always, even in sculpture or wherever you see them, there's a calm, an ascension, a oneness. I don't know much about Buddhism. It's not my thing, but I do respect it. Okay, so this huge array of dogs is a little bit of an outshoot of dealing with the pandemic. At the beginning of last year, so that would have been 2021, I decided for my project for the year to paint a feel-good subject as opposed to the year before, which was dealing with more thematic episodes of the pandemic. So one thing I felt good thing that came out of the pandemic was everybody's love of their dogs and how the dogs helped them through whatever it was they were experiencing on an individual basis. So I put a call out on social media to, if anybody wanted to send me a photograph of their dog, I would paint it to add to my show. And like the next day, I got 100 photographs. So I realized what an interesting subject this would be, a feel-good subject for the year. So every single one of these paintings is somebody's dog that helped them through the pandemic. It's not a shelter dog or, a dog that's passed necessarily, but each dog here has an owner. And at the end of the year, I had this show, and the owner could purchase the painting, but they weren't obligated to do it. But what it did for me, what it allowed me to paint the dog the way I saw it, rather than as a commission, which is a totally different story. So the whole show ended up being 150 dogs, and I did several larger dogs. This is one that's left. And it was the name of the show was called The Puppy Project, which was fun. And Purina actually ended up sponsoring the show, which was also fun because they, of course, love dogs. So that's the dog show. Okay, so this painting is called Goldfish in a Bag. And it's from an experience I had in Hong Kong years ago. I had gone to Hong Kong to visit my son who was living there. And he took me down a street, I think it's called Tung Choi Boulevard or Tung Choi Street. And it is a street all lined with pet stores with fish in cellophane bags from floor to ceiling lining the streets. And apparently in Hong Kong, you can't own pets because it's too dense. So people have fish as their pets. And this is where they go and shop. But it was just like jewels lining the street of all these little cellophane worlds of these captured fish, all kinds of breeds and brands of fish. And so, of course, I had to paint that. And this is bags of, actually, they're really not goldfish, they're guppies, but for the sake of just being brief, they're goldfish. But yeah, a very sterile world, watery world of fish. I just love the volume of the bags and the distortion of the fish. It's just, yeah. Once again, it's my love of water from Florida, only in a contained bag. I always try to think of different ways to present water in my work, which is not easy. So this painting is a figure in the water, and instead of the water being blue and calm, it is charged with heat and energy with the golden yellow palette and the orange fiery figure silhouetted against it, and then the reflection is cool. But I wanted to address a little bit of what I was hearing in the news about the fires in Australia. And I don't know if you remember at that point, I guess it's 2018, the wildfires in Australia were just out of control and really hurting the wildlife. And it was quite upsetting to hear. So I felt like this figure embodied a woman looking back at something on fire and feeling a little bit helpless and concerned about what was happening. So that's the title of this painting, is Australia. And this painting was supposed to be in a show, and it was juried into a national show, and then the pandemic hit, and so the show was canceled, and this painting has never been seen except here. So this is the first time it's been exhibited, so thank you.